He was one of the most recognizable figures in African history, a revolutionary intellect to his supporters, an uncompromising tyrant to his detractors, and for nearly 4 decades, the absolute, unchanging personification of Zimbabwe itself. But something is fundamentally missing from his origin story, and that is the man who was actually supposed to hold the keys to the country. He was the most powerful, highly educated legal mind in the entire liberation movement, and then, overnight, he was blown to pieces. His photographs were scrubbed from party offices. Writing about his military commanders was restricted, and the version of the liberation story that survived was written exclusively by the men who outlived him. The history books tell you that Robert Mugabe's ascension to power was an inevitable act of political gravity, that he was the natural, undisputed choice to lead the people out of the dark ages of white minority rule. But that version of history is a carefully constructed myth. The reality is far more terrifying. This is a deep dive investigation into a hidden history of raw, unaltered power, a story about tribal faction and how it was used as a lethal weapon, about a shadow cabinet called the Zimbabwe that could sentence its own leaders to death, about a secret mutiny in the dense forest of Zambia and that almost broke the revolution, and about how a soft-spoken, fastidious schoolteacher sat in a prison cell for 11 years, watching his rivals destroy each other and stepped over their bodies to seize a nation. To understand how an outsider with no military training took control of one of the most lethal guerrilla armies in Africa, we have to look past the speeches and the liberation anthems. We have to look at the blood on the floor of a garage in Lusaka, a secret declaration signed in Tanzania, and the calculated destruction of a founding father. This is the real story of how Robert Mugabe became the master of Zimbabwe. To comprehend the magnitude of Mugabe's takeover, we must look at the board as it stood in 1974. Rhodesia was a white supremacist state, deeply entrenched, heavily armed, and backed by a highly sophisticated intelligence apparatus called the Central Intelligence Organization, or CIO. The black majority population had been systematically stripped of their ancestral land, forced into crowded reserves, and denied any semblance of political representation. The resistance was fractured into 2 rival camps. In the south and west, the legendary Joshua Nkomo led ZAPU, backed primarily by the Ndebele people and aligned with the Soviet Union. But in the east and north, a more radical faction had split away, ZANU. They believed that peaceful protest was dead. They believed that independence could only be written in the blood of a protracted peasant war. And the absolute, undisputed kingmaker of ZANU's external wing was this man, Herbert Chitepo. Chitepo was an intellectual colossus. He was the first black man in the history of the colony to be admitted to the bar as a barrister. While other politicians were trapped inside the country trying to negotiate with Ian Smith, Chitepo was based in Lusaka, Zambia, running the Zimbabwe, the Revolutionary Council. He was the supreme commander of both the political machinery and the military wing, ZANLA. Chitepo traveled to Beijing. He secured weapons directly from Chairman Mao Zedong's regime. He organized the training camps. He was internationally respected, deeply philosophical, and possessed a staggering intellect that united the desperate ethnic factions within ZANU. To the frontline African president, Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Herbert Chitepo was the revolution. Beneath Chitepo's brilliant administration lay a fault line that would eventually swallow him whole. ZANU was an ethnic mosaic dominated by 3 major subgroups of the Shona people: the Manyika, the Karanga, and the Zezuru. Chitepo was a Manyika. His military commander, a brilliant but ruthless general named Josiah Tongogara, was a Karanga. As the war dragged into the mid-1970s, the front lines became a pressure cooker. The young fighters on the ground were starving. They lacked boots, ammunition, and basic medical supplies. They were dying by the hundreds under devastating Rhodesian helicopter assaults. And inside the camps, a toxic rumor began to grow. that the intellectual leadership in Lusaka, the Dari, was living a life of luxury and corruption, while the frontline cadres were being treated as expendable meat. In November 1974, that pressure cooker exploded into what history calls the Nhari Rebellion. A group of seasoned field commanders, led by Thomas Nhari and Dakarai Badza, launched a bloody mutiny. They seized the Chifombo base camp on the Zambia-Mozambique border. They kidnapped high-ranking officials and executed dozens of loyalist cadres. They accused the High Command of operational detachment. This wasn't a small border skirmish. It was a full-scale civil war within the revolution itself. The ZANU leadership responded with absolute, terrifying ferocity. Josiah Tongogara mobilized the loyalist forces, utilized his superior firepower and ruthless organizational precision to crush the mutiny by December 1974. Nhari, Badza, and their co-conspirators were hunted down, brought before the kangaroo court, and executed. But the end of the mutiny was the mere beginning of a much darker page. Because the top instigators of the rebellion happened to be Manyika, the Karanga elements within the military command used the aftermath to systematically dismantle Manyika influence. Trust within the movement was completely dead. Neighbors looked at neighbors with lethal suspicion. And right at the center of this tribal vortex stood Chairman Herbert Chitepo, trying desperately to hold the fractured party together while his military commanders operated as a law unto themselves. This brings us to the morning of March 18, 1975. Herbert Chitepo walked out of his home in Lusaka, Zambia, and got into his blue Volkswagen Beetle. He turned the key in the ignition. He didn't know that a highly sophisticated TNT bomb had been planted beneath the engine block. The blast was cataclysmic. The car was tossed into the air like a toy. Herbert Chitepo was killed instantly, along with his bodyguard, Silas Shamiso. The explosion was so powerful that it sent pieces of the vehicle into the roofs of neighboring houses. The intellectual heart of ZANU had been completely obliterated. The fallout was instantaneous. Zambian President Kenneth Kaunda was outraged that liberation movements were using his capital city as a slaughterhouse. He didn't wait for an international inquiry. Kaunda's police force immediately surrounded the ZANU office. They arrested Josiah Tongogara, the entire military high command, and very prominent political leader of the external wing based in Zambia. They locked them away in prison, accusing them of murdering their own chairman in a tribal power struggle. Look at the board now. In a simple morning, the external wing of ZANU had been completely decapitated. The chairman was in a coffin. The army commander was in a Zambian prison cell. The party was broken, leaderless, and discredited on the global stage. And it is precisely at this moment, when the night was at its absolute dark, that the spotlight shifts to a quiet, cold prison cell inside Rhodesia. For 11 long years, Robert Gabriel Mugabe had been locked away by Ian Smith's regime. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't fight in the trenches of Chifombo. He didn't know how to clean an AK-47. He was a man of books, holding multiple degrees, and behind bars through correspondence. He was fastidious, cold, and possessed an iron discipline that unnerved both his fellow prisoners and his guards. While in prison, Mugabe held the position of Secretary General of ZANU. The actual president of the party was Reverend Dabaningi Stole. But Stole had committed a fatal political error. Terrified of dying in prison, Stole had secretly written to the Rhodesian authorities, offering to renounce the armed struggle in exchange of his early release. Mugabe found out. Operating with cold legalistic precision inside the prison Mugabe organized a secret internal coup. He convinced the imprisoned executive committee to depose Stole on charges of treason to the revolution. Mugabe didn't raise his voice. He just collected the votes on a piece of paper. When the prison gates finally opened in late 1974 as part of a temporary ceasefire agreement, Robert Mugabe walked out not just a free man, but as the de facto political leader of ZANU inside the country. But walking out of prison didn't mean the army accepted him. In April 1975, weeks after Chitepo's assassination, Mugabe knew that the Rhodesian police were coming to rearrest him. Under the cover of total darkness, accompanied by his loyal lieutenant, Edgar Tekere, Mugabe crept across the border into Mozambique. He didn't enter as a conquering hero, he entered as a fugitive. When he arrived in Mozambique, the reception was freezing. Mozambican President Samora Machel, a hardcore Marxist guerrilla who despised armchair politicians, suspected Mugabe of being a British agent or a tribal opportunist. Machel refused to recognize his leadership. He ordered Mugabe to be placed under a loose house arrest in a remote coastal town called Kalimane, far away from guerrilla training camps. This is the absolute low point of Mugabe's career. He is isolated, distrusted by frontline presidents, and banned from seeing his own troops. But while Mugabe sat in the house in Kalimane, the young guerrillas, thousands of miles away in the Mugagao training camp in Tanzania, were reaching a breaking point. In October 1975, these young radical cadres convened and drafted a document that would completely alter the course of African history, the Mugagao Declaration. They were completely disillusioned by the old political guard. They saw Sithole as a coward, and they saw the external leaders as corrupt. But they needed a political front to represent them to the world, while Tongogara was locked away in Zambia. In the text of the declaration, the young fighters wrote words that affectionately handed Mugabe the crown. They stated plainly that they would no longer follow Ndabanini Sithole. Instead, they declared that the only political leader they would respect was the man who had stood firm in prison, Robert Mugabe. Why did they choose him? Because Mugabe was a blank slate. To the young cadres, his long imprisonment made him a symbol of unyielding sacrifice. But more importantly, the man pulling the strings behind the Mugagao Declaration was a brilliant, highly calculating field commander named Rex Nongo, later known to the world as General Solomon Mujuru. Rex Nongo understood a fundamental rule of revolutionary warfare. An army without a political face is viewed by the United Nations as a global powers as nothing more than a gang of bandits. But a political face without an army is entirely powerless. Nongo didn't want a strong independent military leader who would challenge his authority over the camps. He wanted an intellectual whom he could use to negotiate for weapons in Europe, Asia, while the military remained real on the power. It was a marriage of convenience. Armed with the Mugagao Declaration, Samora Machel had no choice but to release Mugabe from his isolation. For the first time in his life, the school teacher stepped out into the training camps of Mozambique. He didn't wear a suit anymore. He wore green Chinese-style military fatigues. He walked along the lines of thousands of armed men, and as they shouted his name, Mugabe realized that the army he did not build was now officially his weapon. By late 1979, the Rhodesian War had become unsustainable for both sides. The economy of the white state was bleeding out, and the guerrilla forces had successfully made the countryside ungovernable. The global powers stepped in to carve out the peace. The British government summoned all factions to the Lancaster House in London. The British strategy, orchestrated by Foreign Secretary Lord Carrington, was simple. Find a way to grant a formal independence while ensuring that the white minority kept their first economic privilege, most notably the prime agricultural land that comprised 70% of the country. The British wanted a moderate, compliant leader. They desperately wanted Joshua Nkomo or the internal moderate Abel Mzoriwa to win the upcoming democratic elections. They viewed Mugabe as a Marxist monster, a dangerous fanatic. But at the negotiating table, the school teacher completely outclassed the imperial diplomats. While the leaders were eager to compromise just to wrest power, Mugabe dug in his heels on the question of land. He looked Lord Carrington in the eye and threatened to walk out of the conference and send his army back into the hills to continue the war until every single white-owned farm was taken by force. It was a masterclass in brinkmanship. The British realized that Mugabe held absolute power over peace. If he walked away, the war would never end. Nongo's army had given Mugabe the leverage he needed to force the British Empire to accept him as a legitimate player. They had to modify the constitution to fit the demands. The school teacher had rewritten the rules of the empire on a piece of paper in the heart of London. On April 18, 1980, exactly 5 years after he fled across the border as a fugitive, Robert Gabriel Mugabe stood at a podium before a stadium of tens of thousands of cheering citizens. The Union Jack came down. The flag of Zimbabwe went up. He was sworn in as the first prime minister of a free nation. The outsider, the school teacher, who had never fired a weapon, had won the entire board. But erasing the men who came before him did not erase the terrifying question that built his throne. What would Zimbabwe have looked like if the brilliant, unifying Herbert Chitepo had survived that morning in Lusaka? What would have happened if the military command hadn't used a tribal purge to clear Mugabe's path? For the military commanders like Rex Nongo, who signed the Cacao Declaration, they believed they were selecting an intellectual puppet whom they could easily control from the shadows. But history possesses a dark, ironic sense of humor. Robert Mugabe was not a puppet. He was a political servant who mastered the art of survival. Once he held the levels of state power, he systematically neutralized, imprisoned, or outlived every single man who had put him there. Herbert Chitepo was reduced to a footnote, a name given to a single avenue in a capital city. His true history buried beneath decades of state-sponsored mythology, because the architecture of absolute power, the price never goes to the visionary who designs their house. It goes to the survivor who holds the door shut from the inside. This was the video that we had about Robert Mugabe and his alleged coup that he did to Herbert Chitepo. If you have more information and anything else that you know regarding this story, or if there were mistakes that we made in the production of the piece, please be sure to point that out in the comment section. And don't forget to like the video, share the video, and subscribe to the channel so that you see other videos of this nature if they amuse you.